The hospital had always been a maze of antiseptic-smelling hallways, the kind that seemed endless under the glare of fluorescent lights. But tonight, the labyrinth had been swallowed by something far worse than shadows. The power failure came without warning. A stuttering flicker of the overhead lights, followed by a bone-chilling plunge into absolute blackness. It wasn't the kind of darkness where your eyes adjusted, where faint outlines emerged. No, this was oppressive and suffocating, a void so thick it felt like it was pressing against my skin. I sat on the edge of my cot, gripping the thin, scratchy blanket like it was some kind of talisman. The silence that followed the outage wasn't peaceful. It was dense, alive with the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. "Emergency generators will engage shortly," a disembodied voice crackled over the intercom. But even that reassurance sputtered into static and died. I wasn't alone in my ward. None of us were ever truly alone here. Panic erupted among the patients. Somewhere to my left, someone was screaming, their voice high-pitched and desperate. Closer still, another patient muttered prayers under his breath, his words blending with the sound of rattling bed frames and shuffled footsteps. But for me, it wasn't just the darkness that was suffocating. Something else was wrong, something I couldn't quite name yet. My heart thundered in my chest as I peered towards the hallway. From my vantage point, the open doorway framed nothing but pitch blackness. Yet, I swore I heard it, a sound so faint I might have imagined it. Breathing. It was irregular and wet, dragging through the silence like nails over damp wood. The realization crawled through me like ice water. Whatever was out there wasn't human. And then, the scream came. Not a normal scream. This one was muffled, truncated as if someone had clapped their hand over the victim's mouth mid-cry. The sound of it tore through me, paralyzing my limbs as my mind tried to deny what my ears confirmed. One of the patients, perhaps from the next ward over, had disappeared into that awful silence. And as that wet breathing grew closer, I realized I couldn't stay here, waiting for it to find me next. I had to move. The floor was cold beneath my bare feet as I crept toward the open doorway. Each step sent shivers coursing through my body. Whether from the chill or the fear, I couldn't tell. My hand reached out instinctively, brushing against the cold metal frame of the door. I didn't want to cross the threshold, didn't want to leave the fragile sense of safety my room provided. But the sound of that wet, guttural breathing had grown louder, more deliberate. It was hunting. The hallway was no better. The darkness seemed alive, shifting and pulsating like a living thing, a predator waiting for me to stumble further into its lair. My ears strained for any sign of life, any clue about where the others had gone. But all I could hear was the unsteady rhythm of my own breathing, and the wet slap of something heavy against the tiled floor. My stomach turned as I crouched low, pressing my back against the wall. The sound was unmistakable now, footsteps, but wrong. Too heavy, too irregular. The steps faltered at times, like whatever was walking had too many legs or not enough balance. They seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once, echoing through the maze of hallways. I gripped the small plastic flashlight I'd found on a nurse's station earlier that day. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I flicked it on, holding my breath. The pale beam carved through the blackness, illuminating only the stretch of hall directly in front of me. Trash and debris littered the floor, an overturned wheelchair, an abandoned chart, someone's shoe. Nothing moved, yet the air felt too heavy, too full. I turned the flashlight off as quickly as I'd switched it on, fearing that the light would draw whatever was lurking out there. The absence of illumination made me feel blind, vulnerable. My heart was racing, the adrenaline turning my thoughts into static. I couldn't stay here. I edged forward, sliding along the wall like a shadow, using the cool surface to guide me. My ears picked up faint noises now, somewhere ahead, a whisper of movement, the quiet scuff of shoes. Was it another patient, a staff member, or was it that thing? Then I felt it, a wet streak across the tiles beneath my foot, slick and sticky. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I reluctantly pointed it downward. The beam caught the edge of the trail, a glistening smear of dark liquid leading down the hallway. Blood? No, it was too thick, too viscous. A muffled scream erupted from somewhere deep in the bowels of the hospital. My chest tightened as I turned off the flashlight again. Whatever it was, it had found someone else. I wanted to run. I wanted to help. I wanted to wake up from whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. But my legs wouldn't move, rooted to the spot by fear. And then, somewhere ahead of me, I heard it again, the wet breathing impossibly close now. I wasn't alone in the darkness anymore. The breathing wasn't just close. It was everywhere. It filled the air like a humid mist, thick and invasive, and with each slow exhalation, it seemed to press me further into the wall. My pulse hammered in my ears, and for a moment, I thought maybe it would hear that too. Hear the frantic drumming of my terrified heart. I crouched lower, swallowing a scream as the footsteps returned. They were uneven and shuffling, like something dragging itself across the floor. Whatever it was, it moved with an unnerving deliberation, pausing occasionally as if it were sniffing the air, listening for its next prey. I couldn't risk using the flashlight again. I stayed still, barely daring to breathe, my cheek pressed to the cold tile wall. Then came a sound that made my blood freeze. A low, wet gurgle, almost like a voice trying to form words but failing. It came from somewhere ahead, where the hallway branched into two corridors. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, feel the weight of its presence pressing against the dark. I needed to move. Sliding my foot carefully along the floor, I tried to avoid the slick trail of whatever fluid I had stepped in earlier. The smell of copper and decay was overwhelming now, like the whole hospital was rotting from the inside out. My fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. A gurney. I gripped its edge, steadying myself as I prepared to inch forward. Then, out of the silence, a voice, a whisper. Max! It wasn't possible. It sounded familiar, distorted but recognizable. A nurse's voice, maybe? Or one of the orderlies who delivered the bland food trays every day. But no, there was something wrong. The way it said my name, drawing it out in that guttural rasp, was more a mimicry of speech than actual words. It wasn't human. My breath caught as the footsteps stopped abruptly. The breathing grew louder, and a faint dragging noise followed, the sound of something scraping against the walls. I fought the urge to run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but I knew the darkness was its home, not mine. It would catch me if I tried. I needed light. My trembling fingers found the switch on the flashlight. I turned it on, the beam slicing through the void, and there it was, a mass of shifting shadows, rippling and undulating as though alive. It moved like a liquid, flowing and surging along the floor and walls, impossibly black even against the darkness. Tendrils extended from its form, twisting and curling in ways that defied logic, as though it were trying to take shape but couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The flashlight flickered in my hand, the beam sputtering as if the very presence of this thing was draining its life. The shadows recoiled slightly from the light, but only just. Then I saw them, eyes, or at least what I thought were eyes, glimmering within the writhing mass. Too many eyes, too wide, too glossy, reflecting the weak light back at me like a predator sizing up its prey. The gurgling sound came again, rising into something that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so wet, so wrong. The thing surged forward, and I staggered back, the beam of the flashlight bouncing wildly as I tried to keep it trained on the creature. "Stay back!" I choked out, my voice shaking as badly as my hands. The thing hesitated, its movements stuttering as the light caught more of its shapeless mass. For a moment, I thought I might have a chance, that maybe the light was its weakness. But then the flashlight gave a final, pathetic flicker and went out. I was plunged into darkness again, with nothing but the sound of its breathing and the wet slap of its tendrils against the tiles. And it was coming closer. The flashlight was useless now, a dead weight in my hand. I gripped it anyway, as if it could somehow protect me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I clamped a hand over my mouth, desperate not to make a sound. My eyes strained against the oppressive blackness, but the void was impenetrable. I could hear it moving, the sticky, wet sound of its limbs sliding closer, a grotesque symphony of horror. I tried to calculate my next move. If I bolted, it would hear me. If I stayed, it would find me. My options were evaporating as quickly as my courage. Then, somewhere to my left, I heard a soft sound, a faint metallic clang, like a door handle being jostled. My head whipped in that direction, hope surging for a moment. Someone else was alive. The thing stopped moving, as if it too had heard the noise. The wet breathing slowed, its cadence shifting, almost thoughtful. Then it began moving again, but not toward me. It was heading toward the sound, drawn like a predator honing in on prey. I had seconds, maybe less, to act. Summoning every ounce of courage I could muster, I rose to a crouch and began creeping away from the noise, careful to keep my movements slow and deliberate. My hands swept out in front of me, searching for anything solid to guide me. My fingers brushed the cold steel of another gurney, and I used it as an anchor, inching along its edge. Behind me, the sound of muffled sobbing broke through the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to draw the thing's full attention. The gurgling laugh returned, followed by a wet scraping as it dragged itself toward its new target. I wanted to scream at them to stop, to be quiet, but I couldn't risk giving myself away. The sobbing grew louder, punctuated by the sound of frantic footsteps. Whoever it was had started running, their shoes slapping against the tile in a desperate rhythm. And then, abruptly, a scream, raw and animalistic, cut short by a wet, crunching sound. I froze, bile rising in my throat. My legs trembled, threatening to give out beneath me. Whatever hope I'd had that this thing could be outrun was crushed beneath the weight of that scream. I didn't have a plan, just a primal instinct to survive. My hands found the edge of the wall, and I turned sharply, following it blindly. My fingers brushed something, a door frame. Without thinking, I pushed it open and slipped inside, easing the door shut behind me. The room was small, claustrophobic. My palms groped the air until they landed on a shelf. My fingers closed around a cylindrical object. A lighter. My breath hitched as I flicked the wheel. The small flame sprang to life, casting flickering shadows across the room. It was a supply closet, cramped and cluttered with cleaning products and medical equipment. But it was the light that mattered, the warm, comforting glow of the flame, no matter how small. The gurgling noise returned, just outside the door. My fingers tightened around the lighter, the tiny flame trembling with my shaking hand. The thing was right there, inches away, separated only by the flimsy barrier of the door. I pressed my ear to the wood, barely daring to breathe. The wet scraping paused, and for a moment, the silence was suffocating. Then, slowly, the sound of heavy, irregular breathing filled the air. It was waiting, and so was I. The lighter began to burn my thumb, the metal growing hot against my skin. I turned it off, plunging the room into darkness again, and sat in the silence, listening to the thing that refused to leave. The silence was alive, heavy with anticipation. My thumb throbbed where the lighter had scorched it, but I didn't dare move. The thing was out there, its breathing slow and deliberate. It wasn't wandering aimlessly. No, this creature was intelligent, methodical. It knew I was close. I clutched the lighter, a lifeline in the sea of terror. My mind raced, grasping for a plan. I needed to create a distraction, something to lure it away long enough for me to escape. My free hand fumbled through the shelves, knocking over a small bottle. It rolled off the edge and hit the floor with a faint clink. The thing outside stopped breathing. The silence that followed was worse, unnatural, oppressive, as though even the air had gone still in fear. Then came the softest sound, a scrape, like claws dragging lightly over the door. I clenched my teeth to keep from whimpering. The door rattled, not violently, but just enough to send waves of panic through me. I gripped the lighter tighter, its cool metal slick with sweat. My other hand moved blindly across the shelf, searching for anything I could use. My fingers wrapped around a spray bottle. Cleaning solution. An idea sparked in my mind, desperate and reckless. It was risky, but risk was all I had left. I readied myself, adjusting my grip on the lighter and holding the spray bottle at an angle. With one deep, steadying breath, I turned the lighter back on. The small flame cast a fragile circle of light, pushing the darkness back. The door handle jiggled again, and the faintest hiss reached my ears, like air escaping a punctured lung. My heart pounded as I crouched, ready to act. The handle turned, and the door creaked open an inch, then another. I saw it. A sliver of shadow too dark, too unnatural, seeping through the gap. Without thinking, I aimed the spray bottle and pressed the nozzle. A jet of liquid hissed out, meeting the flame. A burst of fire erupted, brighter than I expected, licking at the shadowy tendrils invading the room. The thing recoiled, emitting a guttural, almost pained sound as it retreated. I didn't stop spraying, didn't stop pushing the flame forward. The fire barely illuminated its shape, a mass of writhing limbs and endless eyes that gleamed like oil slicks. Then, as quickly as it had surged forward, it withdrew, disappearing down the hallway with a series of wet, slapping noises. I didn't wait to see if it was coming back. I stumbled out of the closet, gripping the lighter and spray bottle like weapons. The firelight cast fleeting, flickering shadows across the hallway as I moved, each step deliberate and cautious. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the distant hum of machinery that suggested the hospital's generators were struggling to come online. I rounded a corner and nearly collapsed with relief. There was a faint, golden glow emanating from a room further down the hallway. Light. Actual light. Someone had found a source of power, or maybe candles. It didn't matter. All I knew was that I wasn't alone. I sprinted toward the room, my bare feet slapping against the cold tile. The glow grew brighter, spilling into the hallway. As I reached the doorway, I stopped short, peering cautiously inside. The light was coming from a cluster of candles on a table in the center of the room. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by the small, flickering flames. A patient sat slumped in a corner, cradling a flashlight in trembling hands. His eyes were wide and glassy, his breathing ragged. "It's the light," he whispered hoarsely, not looking at me. "It hates the light." I stepped into the room, closing the door behind me and locking it. For now I was safe, but the creature was still out there, and the hospital was vast. I needed to find the main power switch before the candles burned out. The faint, wavering candlelight painted the room in uneven shades of orange and shadow. The patient in the corner was shaking, his knuckles white as he gripped the flashlight, though it was clearly dead. His muttering was a soft staccato rhythm, broken by the occasional hitch of a sob. "It's in the dark, always in the dark. It's waiting, watching." I crouched near the table, taking a moment to catch my breath. The candles smelled faintly of vanilla, a strangely domestic touch in this hellish scenario. My gaze flicked to the patient. He was frail, his hospital gown hanging loose on his emaciated frame. His lips moved silently now, his eyes darting to the shadows that danced along the walls. "It hates the light," he repeated, louder this time. His voice cracked, and he flinched as if expecting the darkness to answer. "What's your name?" I asked, keeping my voice low and even. "L. Lewis," he stammered. His eyes finally met mine, wide and terrified. "We can't go out there. It'll get us. It got the others." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking into my chest. "We can't stay here either. These candles won't last forever." He shook his head violently, his whole body trembling. "You didn't see it," he whispered. "You didn't see its face." I didn't correct him. What I had seen, those glistening, soulless eyes, the writhing mass of shadow, was already seared into my mind. But now wasn't the time to linger on fear. I needed information, anything that could help me find the power switch. "Lewis?" I pressed gently. "Do you know where the main breaker is? The emergency power." His gaze darted to the door, then back to me. He clutched the flashlight tighter, as though it might spring to life in his hands. "Basement," he whispered. "They said the backup generators are there, but it's down there." The way he said it sent a chill racing down my spine. "What's down there?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It is," he hissed, rocking back and forth now. "That's where it comes from. It's worse in the basement." I looked at the candles, their flames dancing weakly. There were maybe a dozen of them, small and quickly burning down to nubs. The room was a temporary refuge, nothing more. If the creature or creatures thrived in the darkness, then staying here was a death sentence. "I'm going to the basement," I said, standing. My legs wobbled beneath me, but I forced them to hold steady. Lewis's eyes snapped to mine, filled with equal parts terror and disbelief. "You'll never make it," he whispered. "You'll die, just like the others." I crouched down, gripping his shoulder. "Then help me," I urged. "We can't stay here. Together, we have a better chance." For a moment, I thought he might argue. But then he nodded, though his movements were stiff and reluctant. I reached for one of the candles, careful not to let the flame extinguish, and placed it into a shallow metal dish on the table. It would serve as a makeshift lantern, at least for a little while. "We stick together," I said firmly, meeting his frightened gaze. "Don't let the flame go out." He swallowed hard and nodded again, his trembling fingers clutching the edge of the table as he stood. I handed him the dish with the candle, and he held it like it was the most precious thing in the world. We moved toward the door. I hesitated, my hand on the handle, and listened. The hallway was silent, but the silence felt wrong, like something was holding its breath, waiting. I opened the door just a crack, enough to let the candlelight spill out into the corridor. The faint glow revealed the same carnage as before. Smeared, dark stains on the floor, overturned equipment, and that oppressive emptiness stretching into the black. I glanced back at Lewis. He nodded once, and together, we stepped into the abyss. The journey to the basement had begun. The hallway was unnervingly quiet, save for the faint hiss of Lewis's shallow breathing and the soft flickering of the candle's flame. Its light didn't reach far, casting a bubble of warmth that seemed impossibly small against the infinite darkness pressing in around us. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat a countdown to the moment we'd be discovered. Lewis walked close behind me, the faint vanilla scent of the candle mixing with the acrid stench of something far more sinister, something decaying. I tried not to think about the origin of the wet streaks we occasionally stepped through or the deep scratches gouged into the walls. Every sense was on high alert, my ears straining to catch the faintest hint of movement. "This way," I whispered, pointing to a set of stairs at the end of the hall. The stairwell loomed like a gaping maw, the descent into the basement shrouded in impenetrable black. A sign above the doorway, barely visible in the dim light, read, "Maintenance, generator access." Lewis hesitated, his knuckles whitening around the dish as he held the candle higher. "It's worse down there," he stammered, his voice barely audible. I swallowed hard and forced myself to meet his gaze. "We don't have a choice. The power's our only shot." He nodded reluctantly, and we stepped into the stairwell. The metal steps groaned under our weight, each creak echoing like a gunshot. I cringed at the noise but pressed on, my hand brushing against the cold railing for balance. The air grew heavier with each step, damp and suffocating, as though the building itself resented our intrusion. Halfway down, Lewis froze. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice quivering. I stopped, straining to listen. For a moment, there was nothing but the distant hum of machinery and our own breaths. Then I heard it, a faint clicking sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from below. It was accompanied by a wet, dragging noise, as if something large and unnatural was shifting in the darkness. Lewis clutched my arm, his grip iron-tight. "We have to go back," he hissed. "It's waiting for us." "No," I said firmly, though my voice betrayed my fear. "We can't. If we don't turn the power back on, it'll find us anyway." He stared at me, his eyes wide and glassy, but after a moment he nodded. We continued our descent, the clicking sound growing louder with each step. My pulse thundered in my ears as we reached the bottom of the stairs, the flickering candlelight revealing a narrow corridor lined with pipes and rusted metal doors. The air here was stifling, thick with a putrid metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The clicking sound had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was worse. I felt the weight of unseen eyes, the sense of something lurking just beyond the edge of the light. "There." Lewis pointed to a door marked generator room. The paint was peeling, and deep scratches marred the surface, as though something had clawed at it in frustration. We approached cautiously, the flame of the candle sputtering as a faint draft whispered through the corridor. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle, my other hand clutching the lighter like a weapon. I turned the knob slowly, wincing as the hinges creaked in protest. Inside, the room was a chaotic mess of tangled wires, exposed machinery, and puddles of oil. A massive generator loomed in the center, its control panel blinking faintly with red warning lights. Relief washed over me. It wasn't completely dead. If I could just get it started. Lewis lingered in the doorway, his candle throwing long, flickering shadows across the walls. "Hurry," he urged, his voice tight with panic. I moved to the control panel, scanning the switches and dials. A faint hum emanated from the generator, promising life. My fingers hovered over a large lever marked main power, but just as I prepared to pull it, a sound froze me in place. The wet, gurgling laugh. It came from the hallway, echoing off the walls and crawling into the room like an unwelcome guest. Lewis whimpered, the flame of his candle dancing wildly as his hands shook. "It's here," he whispered. "It's here." I turned to the door, my blood turning to ice. The shadows in the hallway shifted unnaturally, twisting and curling as something massive slithered toward us. The gurgling laugh grew louder, joined by the wet slap of limbs against the floor. "Light," I said, my voice a harsh whisper. "We need more light." Lewis looked at me, his eyes filled with terror. "The candle? Hold it steady," I snapped, my hand fumbling for the lighter. The thing surged forward, and the last of Lewis's composure crumbled. He screamed, the sound raw and guttural, and the flame of the candle wavered dangerously. I turned back to the generator. No time to think, no time to hesitate. I pulled the lever. The lever clunked into place with a satisfying thud, but for a moment, nothing happened. The generator groaned, sputtered, and fell silent. My stomach sank, dread twisting inside me as I slammed my fist against the console. "Come on," I hissed through clenched teeth. "Come on." Behind me, Lewis's scream cut off abruptly. I turned just in time to see him drop the candle. The fragile flame sputtered out as the dish clattered to the floor, plunging the room into total darkness. "No, no, no," I choked out, scrambling for the lighter. My hands fumbled uselessly in the blackness, the wet, gurgling laugh now filling the room like a toxic cloud. Lewis was sobbing somewhere to my left, a pitiful, broken sound that only made the thing's laughter grow louder, more triumphant. The noise surrounded us, reverberating through the walls as though the creature were everywhere at once. Then the generator roared to life. The room was suddenly bathed in harsh, flickering light. Fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed and blinked, chasing away the shadows. I squinted against the brightness, my heart hammering with relief, until I saw it. The creature was massive, its amorphous body writhing with limbs that seemed to sprout and dissolve at random. Its skin, if it could be called that, was slick and black, glistening as though it were coated in oil. Eyes, too many to count, dotted its surface, each one wide and unblinking, reflecting the harsh light with an eerie, wet sheen. The tendrils that spilled from its body ended in jagged, claw-like appendages that scraped against the floor. And it was looking at me. Louis was on the ground, crawling backward on his hands and knees. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. "It's not stopping," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "The light doesn't stop it." The creature surged forward, its tendrils slamming against the walls and ceiling as it moved with horrifying speed. I grabbed Louis by the arm, hauling him to his feet. "Move!" I shouted, dragging him toward the hallway. We burst out of the generator room, the flickering lights casting frantic shadows as we ran. The thing was close behind, its gurgling laugh now a guttural roar that reverberated through the corridor. The walls seemed to close in around us, the air growing thick and oppressive. "This way!" I yelled, though I had no idea where I was leading us. I just ran, pulling Louis along as the creature's wet slaps echoed closer and closer. Every corner we turned felt like a dead end waiting to happen, the hospital's maze-like design now a cruel trap. Up ahead, I saw an open door, a storage room, or maybe a break room. It didn't matter. It was a chance. "In there!" I shouted, shoving Louis inside. I followed, slamming the door shut behind us and locking it with shaking hands. The room was small and cluttered, the shelves lined with cleaning supplies and discarded equipment. I pressed my back against the door, breathing hard as Louis collapsed against the far wall. His eyes were wild, his hands clutching at his chest. "It's still coming," he gasped. "It's not going to stop." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The sound of the creature's tendrils scraping against the walls outside was enough of an answer. It hadn't been slowed by the light, only angered. My mind raced, searching for a plan, a way out. The lights were on now, but they weren't enough. I needed something stronger, something that would repel it completely. My eyes scanned the shelves, desperate for inspiration. Then my gaze landed on a bulky industrial flashlight. I grabbed it, fumbling with the switch. The beam that shot out was blinding, cutting through the room like a sword. It wasn't much, but it was something. "We're not staying here," I said, gripping the flashlight tightly. "We're getting out." Louis shook his head, his body trembling. "You don't understand," he whispered. "It doesn't let you leave." I ignored him, stepping toward the door. The sound of the creature outside had grown louder, more insistent. It was waiting, coiling itself for another attack. I clicked the flashlight on, the beam cutting through the crack beneath the door. The creature's roar was immediate, a sound of rage and pain that rattled the walls. "Let's find out," I muttered, unlocking the door, and then I opened it. The door creaked open, the flashlight's beam carving a thin, jagged path into the hallway. The thing recoiled, its mass undulating violently as the light struck it. It let out a deafening screech, a sound so unnatural that it rattled my teeth and reverberated through my bones. "Move!" I shouted, grabbing Louis by the arm and pulling him forward. He stumbled, barely able to keep his footing, but he followed, his terror overriding his exhaustion. The hallway stretched ahead of us, illuminated by the sporadic overhead lights. The creature thrashed in the periphery, avoiding the flashlight's harsh glare but staying close, its tendrils scraping along the walls in frustration. I kept the beam steady, sweeping it from side to side to keep the monster at bay. "Where are we going?" Louis gasped, his voice raw with panic. "Up," I said. "We need to get to the main floor." The hospital was a maze, its sterile halls winding endlessly, but I knew one thing for certain. This thing thrived in darkness. Every second we spent in the light was a second we had to stay alive. The creature roared again, its voice reverberating through the corridors like a primal thunder. I glanced back and saw it surge forward, its form shifting and stretching as though trying to fill the space between the walls. It avoided the flashlight's beam but seemed to grow bolder with every passing moment. Ahead, the stairs came into view, a narrow, concrete staircase leading back to the upper levels. My heart leapt with hope, but the creature seemed to sense our destination. It screeched, its tendrils whipping against the walls as it blocked our path. "Keep it back," Lewis cried, his voice breaking. I swung the flashlight's beam directly at the creature, its light slicing through the air like a blade. The thing shrieked and recoiled, its tendrils snapping and writhing as though in agony. It thrashed against the walls, shaking the entire corridor, but it didn't retreat far. Instead, it shifted to the edges of the light, biding its time. "Go!" I shouted, pushing Lewis toward the stairs. "Don't stop!" He bolted up the steps, his bare feet slapping against the concrete. I followed close behind, keeping the flashlight aimed at the creature as I backed up the stairs. It didn't chase us immediately, but I could feel its presence pressing against the edges of the light, waiting for an opening. The stairwell echoed with our frantic footsteps, each step an eternity. The flashlight felt heavy in my hand, its heat radiating into my palm. I was afraid it might die, that the beam would flicker and leave us defenseless. Finally, we reached the top of the stairs and stumbled into the main floor. The lights here were brighter, steadier, but the air still felt thick, oppressive. The creature hesitated at the threshold of the stairwell, its form twitching and rippling as though testing the boundary. Lewis doubled over, his hands on his knees as he tried to catch his breath. "It's still coming," he gasped. "It's not going to stop." I didn't respond. My eyes were locked on the creature, watching as it began to shift and compress, folding in on itself like a shadow collapsing under the sun. It was trying to find a way through. "Come on," I said, grabbing Lewis by the arm again. "We need to keep moving." The hospital's layout was disorienting, its halls all too similar, but I spotted something that gave me a surge of hope, a glowing exit sign at the end of the corridor. If we could make it outside into the open air, maybe the creature would be forced to retreat. "Over there," I pointed, and we started running, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The creature screeched again, louder and more furious than before. I risked a glance back and saw it pouring out of the stairwell, its mass spreading along the floor and walls like a living stain. It moved faster now, relentless, undeterred by the light. We were out of time. The exit was closer now, the sign's green glow a beacon of salvation. I pushed Lewis forward, urging him to move faster. The creature roared, its tendrils lashing out, narrowly missing my legs. Finally, we reached the door. I slammed into the crash bar with all my weight, and the door burst open, spilling us out into the night. Cold air rushed over me, shocking and sharp, but I didn't stop. I turned, slamming the door shut and jamming the handle with a nearby metal rod. For a moment, there was silence. The darkness inside the hospital pressed against the glass window of the door, shifting and swirling but unable to escape. Lewis collapsed onto the pavement, his chest heaving. I stood there, the flashlight still clutched in my hand, staring at the hospital as the creature's gurgling roar faded into the night. "We made it," Lewis whispered, his voice barely audible. But as I looked back at the hospital, its darkened windows looming like empty eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. For a fleeting moment, the chill of the night air felt like salvation. The oppressive weight of the hospital was behind us, its doors now a fragile barrier between us and the horror inside. The gurgling roar of the creature had faded into an eerie silence, and the distant hum of the generator was the only sound that reached us. Lewis sat on the cracked pavement, clutching his knees to his chest, his body racked with trembling sobs. "It can't get out," he murmured, his voice shaking as though he were trying to convince himself. "It's stuck in there. It has to be." I wasn't so sure. My eyes stayed locked on the hospital's shadowed windows, their blackness impossibly still. The building loomed like a monolith, the kind of structure that seemed to breathe on its own, alive in ways I didn't understand. The thing inside wasn't just some random monster, it was connected to the hospital somehow, bound to it, and I had a sinking feeling that it wouldn't stay bound for long. "We're not safe yet," I said, my voice cutting through Lewis's muttering. My grip tightened on the flashlight, its faint heat grounding me in the freezing air. "We need to get further away." Lewis's head snapped up, his face pale and streaked with sweat. "We can't just leave," he stammered. "There are others, patients, staff. What if they're still alive? What if they're gone?" I said, harsher than I intended. His face crumpled, and I softened my tone. "You saw what that thing did. Anyone still in there? They're not coming out." His lips quivered, but he nodded, the fight draining from him. I hauled him to his feet, and we began moving away from the building. The flashlight beam wavered ahead of us, illuminating patches of cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds as we stumbled toward the parking lot. As we reached the edge of the lot, a low rumble stopped me in my tracks. At first, I thought it was the generator acting up again, but this was different, deeper, more guttural. The ground beneath us trembled slightly, sending ripples through the puddles scattered across the pavement. "What is that?" Lewis whispered, his voice barely audible. I turned back to the hospital, dread knotting in my stomach. The building seemed wrong. The windows were still dark, but something was moving inside, a shifting mass that pressed against the glass as if trying to escape. The air felt heavier, colder, and the faint hum of the generator grew louder, vibrating with an unnatural rhythm. The doors we had just burst through shuddered, the metal rod I jammed into the handle rattling violently. Then, with a deafening crack, the doors exploded outward, shards of glass and twisted metal scattering like shrapnel. The thing surged into the night, its mass expanding and contracting as it broke free from its confines. In the dim glow of the parking lot lights, I saw it clearly for the first time. A formless, writhing entity, its surface alive with flickering eyes and snapping tendrils. Its roar split the air, shaking the ground as it turned its attention toward us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Lewis by the arm and pulling him toward the far end of the lot. We sprinted, the creature's screeches echoing behind us as its tendrils lashed out, tearing through light poles and abandoned cars. The flashlight in my hand seemed pitiful against the sheer size of the thing, its beam barely cutting through the darkness. Ahead, a chain-link fence loomed, its rusted surface glinting faintly under the parking lot's failing lights. Beyond it was a dense patch of woods, our only chance to hide. But the fence was tall and the creature was fast. Lewis stumbled, nearly dragging me down with him. I yanked him upright, my voice hoarse with desperation. "Keep moving. We're almost there." The ground trembled again, the creature's bulk crashing through the lot behind us. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it closing in, its presence suffocating, inescapable. We reached the fence, and I shoved Lewis forward. "Climb!" I barked, shoving the flashlight into my pocket and gripping the cold metal links. My hands burned as I scrambled upward, the fence swaying under our combined weight. Lewis made it over first, collapsing on the other side in a heap. I was halfway up when the creature struck the fence, its tendrils slamming against the metal with enough force to send a jolt through my arms. I screamed, clinging desperately as the fence buckled beneath me. With one final surge of adrenaline, I threw myself over the top, landing hard beside Lewis. Pain shot through my ankle, but I forced myself to stand, grabbing him by the arm. "Go!" I shouted, dragging him into the woods. The creature roared behind us, the sound tearing through the trees like a hurricane. Branches snapped and leaves scattered as we plunged deeper into the darkness, the faint glow of the flashlight our only guide. We didn't stop running until the creature's roars faded into the distance, replaced by the haunting stillness of the forest. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The thing had broken free, and now there was nothing to contain it. We collapsed against the base of a massive tree, our breaths ragged and uneven. The air was cold and damp, stinging my throat with every inhale. Lewis leaned against the trunk, his eyes glassy and unfocused, his chest heaving as though the weight of the world was pressing on him. The woods were eerily quiet, as though nature itself was holding its breath. My ears strained to pick up any sound of pursuit, but all I could hear was the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of wind through the trees. "Do you think it stopped?" Lewis's voice was barely a whisper, trembling like a fragile thread ready to snap. I shook my head, gripping the flashlight tighter. "It doesn't stop. It didn't stop in the hospital, and it won't stop now." I looked back the way we had come, though the dense shadows obscured everything. "It's out there, waiting." The thought sent a shiver through me. The creature wasn't bound by logic, by reason. It moved with a relentless hunger, a malevolence that couldn't be bargained with or understood. And now it was free. "We can't just stay here," I said, forcing myself to my feet despite the sharp pain shooting through my ankle. "We need to find help." Lewis looked up at me, his face pale and drawn. "Help?" he said bitterly. "What kind of help? You think anyone can fight that thing? We're all dead. It's just a matter of time." "Not if we keep moving," I snapped, my frustration spilling out as desperation. "We survived this long, didn't we? We'll find a way." Lewis didn't respond. He just stared blankly ahead, his lips moving silently as though he were praying. I didn't have time to coddle him. Gripping his arm, I hauled him to his feet. "Come on." We stumbled deeper into the forest, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness in weak, flickering bursts. The silence was oppressive, amplifying every crunch of leaves beneath our feet, every rustle of movement in the underbrush. My pulse pounded in my ears, my thoughts spiraling into panic with every step. The creature could be anywhere, watching, waiting. "We're going to die out here," Lewis muttered under his breath, his words like a mantra. "It'll find us. It always finds us." I ignored him, focusing instead on the faint glimmer of light ahead. My chest tightened with hope as we drew closer, the glow resolving into a cluster of lights, streetlights, faint but unmistakable. Civilization. "Look," I said, shaking Lewis from his stupor. "We're close. We just have to make it there." We quickened our pace, the sight of safety driving us forward. The forest began to thin, the trees giving way to an overgrown clearing. Beyond it, the outline of a small town came into view, its quiet streets bathed in the golden glow of lampposts. But as we broke into the clearing, I froze. The air changed, growing thick and stifling. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as an all-too-familiar sound echoed through the stillness. The gurgling laugh. I turned slowly, the flashlight's beam slicing through the darkness behind us. At first, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. But then the shadows began to move, coalescing into something vast and terrible. It had followed us. The creature emerged from the forest like a storm, its mass writhing and undulating as it flowed across the ground. Its many eyes glinted in the faint light, fixed on us with a hunger that chilled me to my core. "Run!" I shouted, shoving Lewis toward the town. We sprinted, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand as I turned it back to keep the creature at bay. Its tendrils lashed out, tearing through the trees with terrifying speed, but it didn't fully charge. It stayed close to the edges of the light, circling like a predator toying with its prey. The town was closer now, the glow of the streetlights illuminating a narrow road that led into its heart. I could see houses, their windows dark and lifeless, and the faint outline of a church steeple rising above the rooftops. We burst onto the road, our footsteps echoing against the asphalt. The creature hesitated at the edge of the trees, its form rippling as though testing its boundaries. For a moment, I thought the light might keep it at bay. And then, with a terrible, shuddering roar, it surged forward. The streetlights flickered as it advanced, their glow faltering against the weight of the darkness it brought with it. I turned the flashlight on it again, sweeping the beam across its mass. It recoiled, but only slightly, as though growing resistant to the light's sting. "We need to find shelter," I gasped, dragging Lewis toward the nearest building. "Somewhere we can barricade ourselves." The creature roared again, louder this time, its tendrils reaching for the light. and the lights began to die. The streetlights winked out one by one, each flickering its last gasp of life before plunging us further into the abyss. The creature surged forward, a mass of undulating blackness, filling the empty streets with its terrible presence. Its tendrils scraped against the pavement, curling and snapping as it closed the distance. Inside, I shouted, dragging Lewis toward the nearest building, a small shop with barred windows. The door was locked, but adrenaline drove me to kick it repeatedly until the wood splintered and gave way. We stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. The room was stiflingly dark. I fumbled with the flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows to reveal dusty shelves lined with cans and boxes. A convenience store, empty, abandoned. The perfect place to hide, if hiding was even an option anymore. Lewis slumped against the counter, clutching his chest as he struggled to breathe. His wide, panicked eyes darted to the boarded-up windows, then to me. "It's out there," he choked. "It's coming." "I know," I muttered, scanning the room for anything that could help. My hands trembled as I shoved aside shelves and crates, searching for anything. Fuel, matches, something sharp. But the store was a graveyard, its contents long expired and useless. Outside, the creature's guttural laughter echoed through the streets, a sound that seemed to gnaw at the edges of reality itself. It wasn't just hunting us, it was enjoying this. The flashlight began to flicker. My stomach twisted as the beam faltered, throwing erratic shadows across the room. I smacked it against my palm, desperate to keep it alive, but the light only dimmed further. A heavy thud against the door jolted us both. Lewis let out a strangled cry, backing further into the corner. The thud came again, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of scraping claws. The creature was testing the door, pressing against the barrier as though savoring the moment before it broke through. The flashlight died. The room plunged into pitch-black silence, save for the sound of Lewis's ragged breathing and the creature's gurgling roar. My mind raced, my fingers scrambling to find the lighter in my pocket. It took 3 tries to spark it, the tiny flame illuminating a narrow circle around me. The door groaned under the pressure of the thing outside, the wood cracking and splintering. I held the lighter high, the faint glow casting wavering shadows on the walls. Lewis was curled into himself, muttering incoherent prayers. "Help me block the door," I hissed, but he didn't move. He was frozen, paralyzed by fear, his eyes fixed on the cracks in the wood where tendrils had begun to snake through. The lighter's flame sputtered, and I felt the cold grip of panic take hold. The creature roared again, its tendrils pushing further into the room, curling and twisting like living shadows. I grabbed a bottle of rubbing alcohol from a nearby shelf, ripping off the cap and throwing it across the room. The liquid sprayed out in an arc, soaking the floor and the advancing tendrils. With one hand still holding the lighter, I grabbed an old rag and wrapped it around a broom handle, dousing it in more alcohol. The door splintered fully, the creature surging into the room like a tidal wave of darkness. Its eyes gleamed in the faint light, countless and unblinking, all fixed on me. "Burn," I whispered, lighting the rag and thrusting the makeshift torch toward it. The flame roared to life, bright and angry, casting the room in stark, flickering light. The creature recoiled, its tendrils writhing and twisting as the fire licked at them. It screamed, a sound so loud and piercing it felt like the walls would collapse. I swung the torch wildly, driving it back toward the door. It hesitated, retreating slightly, but its mass remained, its eyes narrowing as though calculating its next move. "Lewis," I screamed, "we have to go." But he didn't respond. He was slumped against the wall, his eyes glassy and lifeless. I didn't have time to mourn him. I threw the torch onto the alcohol-soaked floor, the fire spreading rapidly as I bolted for the back exit. The flames roared, engulfing the room as the creature thrashed and screamed behind me. I burst into the alley, the cold night air shocking my lungs. The streets were still dark, The town silent except for the crackling fire and the creature's agonized howls. I ran, my legs burning, my mind a blur of terror and exhaustion. Behind me, the fire grew brighter, consuming the building and everything inside. But even as the flames rose, I knew it wasn't enough. The creature wouldn't burn. It wouldn't stop. It was out now, loose in the world. And the light couldn't save us forever. Thank you for listening to my story. Like it if you liked it, and write in the comments if it was creepy or not.